Hello, class. I hope you're having a good virtual day, whether it be Wednesday or Thursday. I hope you're enjoying your day at home. Today is going to be a shorter lesson. We're just looking at when consideration might not be required for a contract. So there are a few instances where consideration is not needed. So the first one we're going to look at is promises to charities, right? So you look at places like churches, hospital, most nonprofits, some schools. They really rely and operate on our donations. So people who either donate money or make pledges or promises to pay in the future. Um, the person making the pledge receives nominal consideration, right? So they might have a building named after them or a room at a hospital named after them or nothing at all, really. I mean, you donate, you really don't get much in return. So you might think that because they're not getting anything in return for promising to pledge, that there's nothing that the courts can do. And that's not necessarily true. So courts generally do enforce pledges if for a specific use. So if you're giving money to a church to put a new wing up, add an addition to a church, you're giving money to a hospital specifically for new equipment like an MRI machine. So if you're pledging money to these specific causes, then courts will enforce those pledges. All right. So if you put down that I'm planning on giving you so and so for this, um, these organizations can go back, take you to court, and the court will side in their favor. One exception to this is the dead man status. So if someone were to orally pledge something to a charity right before his or her death, the courts consider this dead man status, so they will cancel that pledge and it will not be enforceable. So you can think about that, being sick in the hospital, you say something like, I'm going to give all my money to the church. I mean, is your family going to be happy with that? Probably not. So they are going to not accept that. The courts won't accept that, and kind of look at that being a little bit of duress, right? You're under pressure. You're not really thinking right. You just want to give something back right before you die. While the courts will not accept that. We also have promises that are covered through the UCC. So we kind of talked about the Uniform Commercial Code before and how it applies to merchants. So this applies to merchants. A firm offer is when a merchant makes an offer in writing for a specific time period. These offers can only be up to 3 months. No consideration needs to be given to make this enforceable. So it's enforceable even when no payment or other consideration has been given to the promise. So if you are a merchant and you promise something, then it can be enforced. Promises barred from collection of statutes. So there's two statutes we're going to look at real quick. The statute of repose, which we talked about a couple chapters ago. It said time a product is purchased within a lawsuit for injuries due to injuries can be brought. So what we're basically saying is from the time you buy a product to the time you get injured from it, if it's longer than 12 years, it's typically not going to be enforced, right? Because it's too long. If it's before that, typically you can bring some kind of claim. Statutes of limitations are similar. So for contracts or torts, it cuts off certain rights if not acted on by a certain deadline. So this is typically 3 years. So if something happens and it was longer than 3 years ago, the statute of limitations is passed, so courts aren't going to hear it. So that is another thing to keep in mind. The difference between the two, repose and limitations. Repose is triggered by the completion of an actual act. Limitations is triggered by the act itself. So complete an act is repose. If an act happens, it is limitations. Another thing to look at too is debts just discharged in bankruptcy. So a person can reaffirm, and what this means is if you get in trouble and you were to file for bankruptcy, think of it as you. Okay, so you at your age cannot buy a car right now, right? You're too young. Um, so say you are 18 and you still can't buy a car because you don't have any credit, right? So your parents sign a car loan and go and they co-sign it for you. So their name is on the lease or on the contract. So is your name. Now, if you were to file for bankruptcy, right, you get in a lot of credit card debt in college, you struggle, you have to file for bankruptcy. That car is going to be on bankruptcy too. And anything that is listed that you co-sign with is going to be listed for your co-signer too. So not only are you filing for bankruptcy, but that bankruptcy is going to show up on your parents' credit report too. And that is not going to be good. Your parents will not like that. So when you reaffirm, it's saying that, okay, I'm filing for bankruptcy, but I reaffirm that I'm going to pay my car, right? So you're going to still pay off that loan. It's not going to really show up in bankruptcy. That'll keep your parents from getting mad at you for and never co-signing on anything for you again. Promissory estoppel. All right. So when someone acts to make a promise, you rely on that promise, you act on that promise, but the person doesn't come through. Courts create a contract for justice. So for courts to invoke promissory estoppel, the following conditions must occur. All right, the promiser should reasonably foresee that the promisee will rely on the promise. Right. So if you promise something, you know that the promisee is probably going to act on what you promised. The promisee, in fact, does act on the promise. So not only does the promiser think they're going to, but the promisee actually goes ahead and acts on it. The promisee would suffer a substantial economic loss if the promise is not enforced. So the promisee is acting on what you promised. You didn't come through. Now the promisee has lost a lot of money. They've lost goods. They've just lost something that has really hurt them. And then the last step is the injustice can be avoided only by enforcement of the promise. So let's go ahead and take a look at this video real quick. I think it kind of shows a good example of promissory estoppel.
In this video, we will discuss promissory estoppel. Promissory estoppel is where we have a promise. There is no return consideration, but the party might still be liable for the promise. Remember, for a contract we need three things: an offer, acceptance, and consideration. And if we don't have consideration, we don't have a contract. With promissory estoppel, instead of consideration, we have a promise that induces reliance, and the court finds some liability for the promise. So look for a situation where one party makes a promise. That party should expect that the person to whom he made the promise will rely on that promise, and as a result, there is an injury. So let's say Patty and her uncle are walking down the street. They pass by a jewelry store, and Patty looks enviously at the beautiful jewelry. Her uncle says, "Go ahead, get whatever you want. I'll pay you $1,000 next week." Patty goes in, she makes a deal for the jewel that she likes. She pays the money and heads out the door. But a week later, her mean uncle says, "Yeah, I changed my mind. No money for you." Now Patty's in trouble because she just spent all that money to buy the jewelry. Patty's upset, but what can she do? There was no consideration for the uncle's promise, and if there was no consideration, wouldn't a court say there was no contract? But this situation seems pretty unfair. After all, the uncle did make a promise, and he should have expected Patty to rely on that promise, and Patty's been injured. And where we have a promise, a reasonable expectation of reliance on that promise, and some sort of injury that appears unfair, a court might apply promissory estoppel. Based on promissory estoppel, the court could assign some liability to the uncle for breaking his promise. If you'd like to discuss promissory estoppel or any other matter related to U.S. law, feel free to comment below.
All right, so that's kind of a smaller example. Another example I would use would be like, say you get out of college and you get a job offer in Hawaii. So you go, you move your significant other or whatever to Hawaii. You guys are there. You spent all this money moving. Um, Once you get there, somehow the job falls through and they don't have a job for you. According to promissory estoppel, you could file a lawsuit against the company who promised you the job. Um, Hopefully, if as long as it's not your fault. I mean, obviously, if you test positive for a drug test or do something that causes you not to get the job, but if they just back out of the job altogether after you moved, you could probably take them to court and sue for relocation fees and things like that. So that would be another example. So that is it for the day. Easy day. Do your 8-3, get it turned in on a canvas. We are going to go over chapter 8 or 7 and 8 next week. You will have a test Wednesday or Thursday of next week over 7 and 8. Then we will move on to other things. So I hope you guys have a good day, and I will see you soon.